good evening. It's been a while since I've done a live stream. I've been asked to do a few live streams in the comments section. Obviously, we've had the Rugby League World Cup, both men's, women's, wheelchair, and physically able or physically disabled uh, uh, World Cups. 12 days to go till the start of the Football World Cup. So not long to go before the start of the Football World Cup. Ralph Husenhartel has been sacked as Southampton manager. Um, we've seen several sackings actually, but I haven't really been keeping up to pace with football side of things. Although I did watch the FA Cup tie last night between Bracknell Town and Ipswich Town because one of my local clubs was playing. Um, so yeah, the Rugby League World Cup. I want to discuss a few issues in regards to that. Crowd numbers is something that I think we can all discuss at length. I've been disappointed with them. I think the crowd numbers can rightly be viewed as disappointing. Absolutely. I have concerns about the semi-final England Samoa at the Emirates and the crowd numbers that are going to be present for that game. I was initially planning to go to that game. However, obviously, the cost is just not worth it, and the time taken for travel. Although I live an hour or so outside London, it's a very very long day, and just the travel and cost is just not worth the reward. The weather isn't particularly great right now, and of course, in 12 months since the World Cup was meant to take place, obviously the World Cup was meant to take place 12 months prior. Um, Prices skyrocketed, and I have noticed when the initial ticket allocations and they were advertising, buy your tickets. Ticket prices are higher now than what they were 12 months ago. So I think that's factored into considerations. We haven't had a single sellout game yet, officially, although a couple of the England games had very few empty seats, no official total stadium sellouts, which is a concern. It'll be interesting to see what the final at Old Trafford has to crowd numbers for that. More's come out obviously about the World Cup, Football World Cup, that is. The fan protests against are ramping up. This is going to be such a divisive tournament. It really is. That I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about watching and trying to do as many match reviews as possible of games. I think it's the concerns are justifiable. I think the frustrations are justifiable. And now what's really funny is Sepp Blatter has come out and said we should never have awarded the World Cup to Qatar, which is funny. And he's placing the blame on Platini and UEFA, ironically, and the votes that UEFA gave forward way back when, all those years ago. And very early on during the process since the awarding of the World Cup, so going back about 10 years, there were concerns about what time of year the World Cup would take place, amongst other things. Yes, it has been a while. Obviously, we've had the Rugby League World Cup to focus on. That's been interesting. We've had the collapse of two rugby union sides, Wasps and Worcester, which again is a big concern. There is obviously mounting pressure on Eddie Jones going into the Rugby Union World Cup next year in France. There's quite a bit going on, actually, to be brutally honest. This is the last year of Holden in the V8 Supercars in Australia before that is before Chevrolet takes their position as the replacement car manufacturer on the grid alongside Ford. So that'll be very, very interesting how that plays out next year with brand new cars, brand new chassis, possibly brand new teams. Um, there's a lot going on in the sports side of things, the sports world side of things. I think uh, with the Rugby League World Cup, crowd numbers is the big talking point, and of course the blowout scores in a lot of games. But the crowd numbers is a massive talking point, um, and ticket prices come up into this. And this is what I find interesting between the Rugby League World Cup, you know, which is ongoing right now, and the Women's Euros in the summer, which the England women won. The difference in crowd numbers, the difference in ticket pricing and marketing and advertising and promotion. It has had a very some big contrasts there, and I know a lot's happened since the summer with the rises in prices. But I think the organisers at the Women's Euros did a very good job, and the organisers at the Rugby League World Cup have done a very bad job. And if you look at my older videos on the Rugby League World Cup when we're discussing the stadium choices, venues, and things like that, it, 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 I raised some concerns, say, oh, the organisers are going. This is back in 2018, 2019, that the organisers were going very, very conservative, and it was a good chance to grow the game. Yeah, there's been all sorts of problems with the Rugby League World Cup and ticketing. Yes, we are closing on 1,000 subscribers. We'll get there. At the moment, this is there's things going on with work, and I'm thinking about a possible change of career and uh, possibly moving overseas. So there's a lot going on outside of this. Um, and so the last couple of months, the YouTube has taken sort of a secondary nature to where I would want it to be, but there are things going on. That is what I call the real world that need to be taken into consideration. I've got a lot of interesting and tough conversations ahead in regards to employment direction and retraining and looking for new work and new opportunities and possibly moving overseas. Uh, that's a possibility. Certain things have to go into line for that to work. In regards to Worcester and Wasps, yes, I mean, look, the situation was utterly avoidable. Wasps, it's been a well known, it's been a badly kept secret about Wasps' financial problems since before COVID. This is not a new thing. And it's not a new thing for club rugby either. The Welsh game is in financial crisis and has been for a very long time. Worcester, COVID did for them, but in Wasps' case, this is a long-standing issue, um, and it's partly to do with the stadium and the relocation from London, well, great southeast England, really, to the Midlands. Um, I work with a couple of uh, rugby fans who are also rugby players at one of the local rugby clubs, and this has been discussed at length. Uh, when in the mornings before we start shift. Um, the situation, I don't think these are going to be the last two clubs to face this problem. I think at the moment the situation is precarious. There could be the domino effect. Uh, the ring fencing of the Premiership has clearly had a negative impact as well. And there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming of other people rather than a concerted effort to work together to avoid this happening again. But in my lifetime, it's now happened 4 times where teams have gone bust in season. It last happened when I was a kid with Richmond. And I believe was it London Scottish or London Welsh originally? London Welsh have since gone defunct, but this is not the first time it's happened. But the rules with rugby union clubs going into administration of football, as we've seen, are completely different. Um, and professionalism, I think, professionalism hasn't fully worked. Not how it was truly intended. I think um, there are structural issues with the game that I don't think have been properly addressed. Um, the way the game has evolved over the last 15 or so years has gone down a completely different path um, uh, than was predicted for. You could argue since maybe the 2003 World Cup and England winning that, there was a lot of players suddenly getting these big sponsorship deals, these third party payments, and there was a different interest in the game. There's been so much controversy surrounding Wasp's first merger with London Irish and then a relocation to Norwich. I'm not sure London Irish really want to take on the financial mesh that's Wasps because that will then destroy them as well. Uh, Rugby union isn't really big in East Anglia, if no one's really noticed. Um, there's not the population size to really sustain football, let alone rugby union on top. Look at Lincolnshire, Norwich, and Suffolk, Norfolk and Suffolk. Sorry, East Anglia just doesn't have um, the corporate money, doesn't have the population size, and geographically, there's not really a massive motorway network. It's quite geographically isolated in a sense from large portions of the rest of the country. Uh, it, it, it doesn't truly work, and I'm not sure how Norwich City fans would feel about Carrow Road being turned into a mud bath every other weekend by Wasps. Um, the situation though with Wasps, and I'm kind of glad they got that Rugby League International done days literally as during the World Cup at the Coventry Building Society arena, which was formerly the Rico. Um, look, the situation with Wasps is also affecting Coventry City because of the stadium issue, which is very, very complex. But merging clubs doesn't fix the problem. It just means another club in that maybe slightly better financial position has to take on all the debts and creditors of the club that's not in a good financial position. And it does nothing to solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road and someone else has to pick up the bill. But no, it is a shambles. I mean, I think they the relocation to Coventry hasn't worked. Yeah, look, I used to regularly go to the double header at Twickenham with my stepdad years ago for several seasons in a row, and you would see fans of Wasps, Saracens, London Irish, Harlequins, you know, all going to games together, and that was a big. That was like the beginning of the season. It was it's like the All Star game in the NRL, for example, or the Magic Weekend in the Super League and NRL. The outdoor games in the NHL, the London Series for the NFL. It was one of those marquee events for the domestic league, the domestic game, and relocating to Coventry, I to me comes across as a bit of a brain dead decision. Um, but there is no simple solution to the problem. Liverpool aren't fully up for sale. That's a misnomer. That's again a false headline that's being peddled in the media. The Liverpool situation is the Fenway Sports Group are open to potential investors to buy a stake in the club. It's an easier way to raise funds and also reduce the financial overheads for the Fenway Sports Group. Um, it's a way to get investment. They're not fully selling. Um, that is a clickbait headline you're going to see on a lot of news websites, a lot of forums. Yes, I know Coventry beat Blackburn. Please, let's move on with that. That's old news. But the the Liverpool situation is any owner can go. We're open to new investment, and we'll be opening to any percentage of sale of shares. For example, they could list Liverpool on the stock exchange, and we could buy shares in Liverpool Football Club. Man United and Newcastle did that back in the 90s. They were listed on the stock exchange in London. It's a great way to raise revenue and raise investment without having to dip into your own pockets. Um, but a lot of American sports teams operate this kind of model over in the US. Um, Now, this what is interesting is Fenway Sports Group this time last year bought a majority stake in the Pittsburgh Penguins NHL franchise, which is also very, very interesting. And they spent a lot of money on that purchase. So, and I did that when I had a brief look at the Fenway Sports Group video. We looked at their sporting holdings and where their investments lie. So that was a major um, purchase that a major investment. Now, Liverpool is a big brand in the global game, in global sport. It's a very big brand. Um, if they were to do a survey of fans in Merseyside, um, nearly two-thirds of fans in Merseyside support Liverpool on the Liverpool side of the river. One-third support Everton, and then you've got obviously on the Birkenhead side of the Mersey and the Wirral. The Wirral basically it's a bit different because you've got Tranmere Rovers there, but on the Liverpool side of the Mersey, it's a two-thirds split, 2 out of 3 split. So they've already got the market locally, which wasn't always the case, by the way, but they won the market in the local area, in the local metropolitan area. And then you look further afield at fans outside of the city of Liverpool. And I can count a lot of members of my family as fans outside the city of Liverpool. There's a lot of people who've moved out of the city of Liverpool, either around the UK or around the world, who are still fans of the football club. They've had kids, they've had grandkids, that kind of thing, that kind of family heirloom kind of thing where you carry on the fandom. You support the club of your father and your grandfather, that kind of thing. So there's fans in Australia, there's fans in the US, there's these are fans who originally are from the Merseyside area, and then you've got the new fans that have bought in to the Premier League era. So those fans in the US that have no connection to the city itself, who bought into supporting the new fan base, the global fan base. So they are a big brand. They do make a lot of money. But at the same time, they've got they've spent a lot of the owners have spent a lot of money recently, so they need to get investment. Selling a small 5 to 10% stake in a club is not selling the club. It's selling shares in the club. It's raising investment capital. It's a good way to look at it. Is the injury thing at the World Cup going to hamper the quality? Injuries and suspensions. I did say this would be a thing, and we've seen it in the Rugby League World Cup where players got suspended and injured going into the Rugby League World Cup because the season's only ended, both Super League and NRL, literally a couple of weeks before. So some players join the tournament midway through, and then they're not fully match fit. We're like 12, 13 days away from teams leaving for Qatar, so we're not far away. We're not far away at all. And quite literally, the Rugby League World Cup literally finishes like a day before the Football World Cup starts. Something ridiculous. So we are not far away from the start of the tournament. I think it's about 12 days. Um, and I would argue that we are seeing players going down with injuries. We are seeing players getting suspended. Some players are actually going to retire. Um, had the World Cup been held at the proper time, I know we'll be having a different discussion. Um, is it going to hamper the quality? It may mean a player that otherwise wouldn't have gone gets a bit of exposure. So we'll see what quality's like. I'm the fact that they are paying people to promote positive tweets and positive social media about the World Cup tells you that the organisers are deeply concerned about the amount of tickets not going sold. They were predicting over 1 million fans going to Qatar. Can't see that happening somehow. We'll see what the tournament's like. In my opinion, I'm reserved on what quality is going to be like. Looking at the Rugby League World Cup, a lot of blowout scores there. Players coming off injury and suspension who aren't fully match fit. Um, and I've been very, very critical. I know there's been a lot of criticism, should I say, of the Rugby League World Cup, the crowd numbers, the blowout scores, the unbalanced groups, the formatting of the tournament. The World Cup's going to get the same criticism. And I think it is going to struggle to keep up with the quality of the Euros and the Copa America that we saw last year. But if we're going by the Africa Cup of Nations that we saw, 10 months ago, can't be as bad as that. That was shockingly poor quality. So, and that's a mid-season international tournament, and I think that's sort of what the quality could deteriorate to. We don't know what the pitches are going to be like. We don't know what the crowd numbers are going to be like, and how the climatic and weather conditions are going to impact the players. But yeah, players are going down injured. There's not this is not a traditional World Cup in sense of preparation. And I will say this: I've seen a couple of bad World Cups in my lifetime. When I say bad World Cups, they weren't terrible, but when you're comparing them to others, they rank lower. So the '94 USA World Cup and the 2010 South Africa World Cup are my two least favourite. Whereas World Cups like the 2006 World Cup and the 2018 World Cup ranked quite highly, and the Brazil World Cup in 2014 ranked quite highly. The other ones ranked quite lowly. I think Qatar is going to be bad. I think crowd numbers, they're going to have to pump fake crowd noise in. I reckon that players are going to be very, very lethargic. I would reckon that the international teams aren't going to quite get those combinations right, and so we could see some very scrappy group stage games. And there are some managers who are international coaches going into this tournament under a lot of pressure. So Gareth Southgate's under a lot of pressure. That tournament, I think he's done. But we'll see what pans out over the next couple of months. Do I have Discord? Don't use it. I'm thinking about deleting a lot of my other social medias apart from this. I'm thinking about getting rid of my Instagram. I'm thinking about getting rid of my Twitter for Elon Musk reasons. And I'm seriously considering possibly not posting on Facebook as much. I think, especially the Twitter situation, what we've seen on Twitter with a lot of cases involving sport, related to sport, but in general, it's Twitter and Facebook over the last couple of months that I've found engaging with people. Twitter especially is just a sewer of humanity. It's absolutely it's chronic. And now they've got Elon Musk running the show. I think a lot of people are going to switch off. And to be fair, I've never really fully engaged with Twitter, if I'm being honest. I've never fully got behind Twitter at all. Never really enjoy it. Facebook, yeah. I used to do the Facebook games like Zynga Poker and Farmville and all that, but I don't really take Facebook seriously. Apart from posting, reposting content like this when I do my videos, I just share memes. I don't put any personal stuff on there anymore. I've had a few Facebook bans for my sense of humour, but no, I don't. I think social media. If we go back in time to the 2012 Olympics or the 2010 World Cup, okay, Twitter was in its infancy, as in mainstream infancy. It had been a bit of a niche social media network. Facebook was still reasonably new, and what we've seen following with high profile athletes, sports teams, the abuse, the lawlessness on that social media, and the negative influence we have seen. Uh, yeah, It's not my thing. The World Cup attendance will be small anyway. Add in the cost of living, it would just be full of empty heads, pretty much. I do reckon the atmosphere is going to be poor. When they had the World Championship Athletics several years ago, day one crowd numbers were absolutely appalling, and they had to pay people. Um, they paid people to go in. Um, they were actually paying some of the stadium workers. Will pay you an extra couple of dinars a day or rupees a day just to be a fan for a day. And the athletes competing there were like, it was eerie, it was unnerving, they didn't like it. And this is before COVID. Now COVID's been and gone. Players will probably be more used to having half empty stadiums, but it won't look good for TV. It looks shocking for TV, and then you've got to think of the commercial sponsors and the commercial partners, and that's where you start having a problem. Look what's happening with Twitter right now. Controversial takeover, controversial plans being put in. A lot of the staff being laid off, which I think was handled badly and possibly illegally. So Muskie boy, maybe having a lot of lawsuits and false and unfair dismissal claims against him. Big payout. He didn't even want to buy the company in the end, so it's just a ego trip for him. But he's a Bond villain. But other companies are like, we're going to withdraw sponsorship from your media platform. We're going to pull our money out. We're not going to partnership with you anymore. We could see the same thing with the Qatar World Cup. If viewership figures are poor, crowd numbers are poor, and engagement is poor, some big sponsors may go, we're not so keen on sponsoring the next tournament, or we may scale back our sponsorship arrangements. Now, a lot of these sponsors are on long-term contracts that they've signed up. They're very hard to get out of, but they may not want to renew those sponsorships. It's like EA Games with the FIFA franchise. When it comes up to a contractual renewal of a partnership, let's say Budweiser, McDonald's, Hyundai, Kia, these kind of your mainstream companies may go, we don't want to extend our contract with FIFA. And that's something they have to be aware of, is the commercial side of it when it comes to sponsorships, when it comes to commercial arrangements. They may have to seek new sponsors. Yeah, this is basically the direction club football's taking, and mainstream, the 99%, I call the silent majority, have become vocal. And what we've seen over the last, I'm going to say, few years, and I'm going to say COVID has accelerated this, but even before in the years building up to the COVID pandemic, fans were already saying enough's enough. We've been priced out of stadiums. Merchandise prices are too high. Players' wages are too high. Transfers are getting out of control. Just the TV price wasn't right. COVID comes along, and then we have the European Super League. I think this is the turning point. The European Super League, and the fallout from that attempted semi-breakaway, but not fully sanctioned competition, and the attempted money grab and power grab. Fans globally were like, no. And bear in mind, we're still not fans of UEFA. UEFA still has a lot of problems, and we've seen that across European games where clubs are angry with the direction UEFA has taken the sport, the direction FIFA has taken the sport, and because the governing bodies have followed the blood money, as I will call it, the black gold, the poor human rights kind of money, the blood money. Clubs have been doing it as well, and there are question marks about the ownership of a lot of clubs, and where the money comes from, and how legitimate the money is. And I've seen documentaries and interviews given where even in minor leagues or lesser leagues around the world, it's a great way to launder money. The A League in Australia, I watched a Four Corners episode on that on YouTube. You can watch all the Four Corners episodes on YouTube, but they were questioning um, the, the money followed the paper trail. They were questioning the investment, and they were questioning the ownership rules and how weak many leagues are in regards to their directors test. And Australia is one of those leagues that has a very weak. It needs the investment. It needs the money pumped in. It needs to grow its profile. It's competing against the AFL and the NRL in Australia for that market, and they're desperate for investment, and not a lot of domestic investments coming because the money's tied up with Aussie rules and rugby league. So they looked overseas, and unfortunately, overseas is not necessarily grass isn't always greener, and they're finding out the hard way. And other professional sports are finding it out the hard way as well. It's not just football. This isn't just a a European problem or the World Cup being in Qatar, the FIFA World Cup being in Qatar. No. This is a global sports problem where, for example, we could be looking at, I don't know, we want to start up this cricket league, for example, in the US. They want to look at, you know, um, rowing other leagues around the world, investing. It's the thing. I've heard some stories about how expensive the World Cup will be. I know some people who are going to Abu Dhabi and flying into Qatar to watch the games. Yeah, look, that to me, that's nearly half a year. That's over thereabouts. You know, a fair chunk of annual salary. You know, I'm what am I earning? 12 months at 1,500 quid. Hang on a sec. I just want to work something out roughly at what I'm taking home. Um, and I can work, and this is before tax, so the tax man can fuck off. I don't like the tax man right now, but we're going to work something out. Um, this is why I'm looking at new work opportunities. That's ridiculously scary, but that's very that's over half my annual salary just to watch it. This is where that is just not sustainable at all, and frankly, that's ridiculous. Well, if you're taking in two sporting events together, that makes a bit more sense than. But even so, that's still a ridiculous amount of money. That's over half my annual salary a year. Um, that's not including the overtime that I do. So I've approximated what I'm taking home. That is a lot of money, um, and with everything going up, that is ridiculous. I've had to cancel and cut back on so much stuff. It's unreal. Um, I live in an overdraft. That's why I'm looking at potential career change, salary changes, stuff like that. That is ridiculous. It but it also depends on how many games they're going to see, what level of ticket they purchased. That's not including accommodation, food and drink. The fact that they decided to grab the F1 as well is interesting. But at the same time, that's a lot of money. To some people, that's half a year's wages. That's over half a year's wages for me on a standard rate. Like that is ridiculous. There's a reason why a lot of my colleagues have 2 jobs. Okay, that's 3 group games. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. Um, and well, Qatar isn't a big country, and most of the stadiums are around Doha, which is the main capital city within 50-kilometer radius of the city centre. That's a lot of money. I don't care if they're also grabbing the F1 as well, but that's a lot of money. Um, that is ridiculous, and this is where the working class. I mean, this is where some fans who are coming from all over the world are giving up a year's salary just to watch a game or 2 games. And I don't think the players quite realise that. I don't think the coaches and players and the squads that are going fully appreciate how much it actually costs the fans, us, to support them around the world. I don't think they fully are on the same wavelength. And this is a criticism that's thrown at the players: is they're taking these tokenistic, taking the knee gestures, wearing the rainbow armband, but in reality they don't live in the real world. Because £10,000 is that's eye-watering. That's nearly my brother's full annual salary. He's on about 13, 14. I mean, I'm paid about 18 grand a year. My brother's taking home 30 grand a year. Like, that is ridiculous. That is on a scale that I just that is obscene. And I don't think that a sport without fans is literally a hobby played by enthusiasts. It's a good way to look at it. And what we saw through COVID with the empty stadiums was how important fans being at games, actually buying tickets, buying merchandise on the day really was to the game. And we were told for years that we can let the fans in for a very little price or not at all and still make a massive profit off the TV deal. So we were lied to about the actual finances of football 3 years before COVID actually, 3, 4 years before COVID hits. About 3 years before COVID hits. The clubs actually admitted they claimed at the time they could let us in for very, very little money or for free, and they would still make a profit, right? And then we see empty stadiums and they're hemorrhaging cash and they're furloughing, non-playing staff, and they're asking for bailouts from the government, and they're asking their players to take wage cuts. So in the space of 2, 3 years, something happened. Either they were lying to us, which we know they were, or costs ballooned, which they did. And then over the last 2 years, with reduced capacities at some games, some jurisdictions, having various lockdowns and empty stadiums and lost revenues, and this is not just football, this is in various sports, how it actually impacts leagues. And it proves how important fans and attendance actually are to your product. It shows how important fans physically being at games is. And without fans physically being at games, it's striking. It is very, very striking, and they're in denial. They are in denial about the real world. I mean, watching that game last night was refreshing, the Bracknell Ipswich game, because every single one of those Bracknell players has a full-time job and balances that being a semi-pro football player. And back in the day, when you were in the reserves or coming through the youth ranks, you had to have a job. You had to learn a trade. It's the same in rugby league. You 10, 20, 30 years ago, so when I was a little kid, if you made first grade, you might not have to have a secondary job. You could actually get by being a professional rugby league player, for example, in the NRL 20 years ago. But if you were a reserve grade player or coming through the junior ranks and the various reserve grade ranks, a lot of them were part time and had jobs. And what they used to do was they used to, say his club position and then his secondary job, which would be shoe salesman, car salesman, plumber, student, whatever they were doing as their other form of income or education. You would see it on the TV. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. They'd be like, oh, so and so playing for Parramatta, debut. He's coming from reserve grade. Oh, by the way, on weekdays, he's a painter decorator. So if you didn't make it in the professional sporting world, you had a career to fall back on. For some reason, that connect between giving the players an option where if they don't make it in the sport for injury, health reasons, maybe they don't make the cut, they don't make the grade, they have a career pathway to go into and training to go into. We've lost that connect, so they don't live in reality. They're brought into these academies very, very young. They aren't really educated about the real world and what happens outside of the academy walls and the sport. And then by their early 20s, they're paid 50, 60, 70, 80 grand a week. When they hit their peak form in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, they're paid stupid money. And when they retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. Some footballers live in the real world. Players like Vardy, Robertson, Morgan came from non-league. And yeah, okay, look, Grant Holt, Jamie Vardy, Ricky Lambert, yeah, some past and current players, I completely get that. Some. I think the best example would be Ian Wright. He jumped straight from non-league to football league. He missed out the lower leagues. He went straight to Crystal Palace from the non-league in his early I think it was early 20s. Would be a good example of a player from the 80s and the 90s making that transition. But when you say some, you've listed about 3 or 4 players there. That's not a lot. That is kind of worrying that a small percentage at the top level obviously had to do it the hard way. Some of them had some legal pitfalls, like Jamie Vardy had some issues along the way. Ian Wright famously had some issues along the way with skirting the law a little bit. But that aside, the only other example that really comes to mind of someone who's actually trained in a career outside of football is Stuart Pearce. He's trained as an electrician or a plumber. Is either a plumber or electrician? I think he's an electrician. So he had a career to fall back on should things not work out, which they obviously did for Stuart Pearce. Ultimately, that's the one that springs to mind in my head. There was one of the Man United class of '92 who's now a postie. He decided to give up the game and not very long into his career and goes, "No, I'm not interested." I forget his name, but he's now a postman. So there are some, but it's rare. And I think the direction the sport has taken over the last 25, 30 years isn't necessarily the best direction it could have taken. While I agree that the wage cap that Jimmy Hill argued to remove was the right idea at the time, it's had some unintended consequences. The wage inflation, and even players who were playing in the 90s are going, look, we were paid like 5, 10 grand a week. We were like, this is good money. We're making some good money here. They are stunned by some of the weekly wages players are getting now. They're like, no, that's what we're earning in a year. Like the average weekly wage now is what a player would earn in a year. And that is the general concern. And some of these players in the nights, like Paul Mercer, that had issues with gambling and addiction, and they're like, "Look, I was earning what 5, 10 grand a week, max." Some of these players are earning 5, 10 grand per game. Like they're earning 10 times what he, and that is another issue that I think that the wage inflation is out of control massively. The transfer fee inflation is also not sustainable. And the club valuations, I think, are off as well. I think they're artificially inflated. So that is interesting. Yeah, I'm not disputing Vardy, Robertson, and Morgan, Grant Holt, and a few others have had a lot of success in the game at various levels and being record club scorers and all that. Ricky Lambert things, and they are good examples to use of players that have lived in the real world and held down your 9 to 5 job and that kind of thing. But the the wage inflation is deeply concerning for me. The transfer fee inflation is deeply concerning to me, and the overinflation of club value is ridiculous. And I think a lot of that's artificially inflated. There is a concern that I think what was look same in rugby union, what we've seen with Wasps and Worcester. There's going to come a point that Barcelona cannot keep breaching financial fair play the way they are. They are owing players and business partners ex-players money. They owe a lot of money to a lot of people, and they are basically fiddling the books publicly to do it now. There's gonna come a point where the system completely grinds to a halt. Players' prices have gone insane. I agree. There is talk about Bellingham being the most expensive player when he moves. Look, I mean, how old is Bellingham? What, 18, 19, 20 years old? And we're talking about Job or other Bellingham because there's the brothers, isn't it? That is wrong. Um, that puts a lot of unnecessary pressure upon a very young person who is going to be then living their life in the media spotlight, regardless if they're a success or not. Because if they fail, let's say they get a career-ending injury next season, or a couple of seasons down the line, and they have to retire. That's going to hang over them for a long time. We've seen a lot of these young players really struggle to adapt to the media following them around. They really struggle with the weight of fame, so to speak. We've seen a lot of them over the years, time and time again, end up, struggling um, with addictions, um, with bad life choices. And I constantly go back to the Paul Gascoigne example and the Diego Maradona. And to a certain extent, you could use Paul Merson, you could use Tony Adams. And these were like less, I wouldn't say they weren't high profile, but they were less superstar star players. And the, and I use these examples because they happened in my lifetime. You saw what happened. I mean, I watched the Paul Gascoigne documentary, and quite literally that, yeah, Gascoigne did some things that aren't acceptable. The domestic violence allegations are not acceptable, and they were proven that they're not right. Um, so I can't agree with what he's done there. I don't condone it. But then people were saying, "Oh, mate, you're paranoid." Saying happening when actually it was. And then we look at how the press and the public treated him, and we look at what it's done to his mental and physical health. That's not cool. And the British media, in fact, the media in general, has a lot of blame apportioned to them, and they don't accept that they can't. This is why I'm not a big fan of the media, really. Jude Bellingham, 19, doesn't turn 20 till June, so he's 7 months younger than my brother. Um, that is a lot of pressure to put upon a young player who's already moved away from home. He's moved to a different country, let alone different city. He's moved countries. He's you know that is a lot of pressure to put upon a very very young player, and I've seen it in a lot of sports. Some players and some individuals feed off that and do really well. Others really struggle, sometimes privately, with the expectation, the media spotlight, The speculation over everything they're going to do. It That's a lot of unnecessary. I honestly think there needs to be some kind of spending cap rules and tiers of spending. I do think something's going to have to give within the footballing financial system. We've already seen rules put in place to protect young players in other sports and other leagues, where their maximum first contract can be X amount per season or X amount per year, like entry level. So they can't sign these superstar massive contracts too soon. For the first few years, they are professionals. Um, but we've seen some shocking contracts given out to players, and they fail to live up to expectations. Injuries take their toll. Um, the amount of players who've retired young. I mean, David Bentley's a very interesting example, and his when questioned about why he retired from the game, yeah, he was like, "There's too much money in it. Players are getting paid too much," and this is about nearly a decade ago. A player was saying, "We're getting paid too much. I don't enjoy playing anymore. Um, Too much money in the game. No love for it." Um, True. He might have possibly a more grounded and therefore humble. I would say humble background. I would say a more stable um, background and family unit, which is good. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean things are going to be perfect. We've seen a lot of players who've got really strong family backgrounds, but they're very strong United family backgrounds that don't you know deal with things so well. Mason Greenwood is a prime example that we have been discussing at length for a very very long time. Um, from a hard-working, lower middle class background, strong family unit. Look how he's ended up. Um, and I think and while we can say, yeah, his upbringing and his family background is good and solid, and his family have sacrificed a lot to get him where he and his brother are now. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work out perfectly. Um, and unfortunately, the media has a big part to play in this. That hypes up an individual. There's a thing called tall poppy syndrome. Um, I hope that we need to look at if he goes as the most expensive player of all time. I don't think that Neymar transfer record gets broken. Quite honestly, I really don't, because at the time in 2017, there were eyebrows raised about the amount of money paid for Neymar. Um, and look how much money they're paying Mbappe per week. That would clearly, whoever pays that money, considering the financial plight a lot of clubs are reporting themselves in, that is a clear breach of financial fair play. Straight up. Huge questions will be asked of whoever pays that transfer fee, because it has to be in the realm of 300 million. Would have to be a third of £1 billion. Neymar went for a quarter of a billion, 200 to 250, depending on the source. You're looking at 3 to 400. That is not justifiable in any stretch of the imagination. Not justifiable at all. Cannot be justifiable. And then questions again will be asked about which club would be paying the money. And huge questions. Now, Borussia Dortmund have had their money issues in the past where they've run out of cash, and they've had the odd issue where they've been forced to sell some of their better players, and be less competitive for a period of time. But whoever pays that money, that's going to be interesting. And you look what's happened to Barcelona, and you look at the amount of money they owe to other clubs and current and former players. It is a wonder and an amazement to me that anyone wants to sign there and play there. Um, and then you look at Real Madrid and Juventus, the European Super League clubs. Football is an embarrassment now, and UEFA are embarrassing themselves by not taking firmer action with these three clubs and other clubs as well. They cannot bring in the new financial rules quick enough. They can't. You cannot solely blame COVID for the financial situation that clubs find themselves in, because the reckless spending was going on for years before COVID. There were economists saying that this is similar to the subprime mortgage crisis that led up to the financial crash 14 years ago. They were comparing football's finances to what happened in the 90s and the 2000s in regards to the subprime mortgage crisis and the financial markets basically shutting down 14 years ago. The fact that economic experts, not just football experts, but economic experts, are saying that football as a sport globally is like the mortgage and financial markets globally a decade earlier. Then COVID hits. COVID was the moment where, much like the financial meltdown in 2008, there was a trigger, and it happened to be whatever the trigger made. It's like Northern Rock went bust the year before the financial markets went bust. So that's your berry, your smaller fry in the big pond, small fish in the big pond. And now you've got your Barcelona, your Real Madrid, and Juventus basically on their knees. And you've got other mid-sized clubs on their knees. You needed a trigger. Berry was the trigger, literally. And I was saying at the time in 2019, just over 3 years ago, that there is going to be a domino effect. There will be more. Now, the fact that Macclesfield is the only English club to go tits up in the professional game amazes me. The fact that no one in Europe at the moment has officially gone, we've got to reform, we've got to liquidate, gone bust, amazes me. And football's financial mismanagement, and that's what I'm going to call it, because this is almost criminal, has caught up with itself. And I'm no economic expert, but something is very, very off with the state of the wage inflation and the transfer fee inflation, the contract inflation. You look at it hasn't kept pace. Other sports have grown or financially grown at a lesser pace, at a more realistic pace, and they're having problems. Rugby union, rugby league, for example. Football's gone through the roof. Rugby league and rugby union, as I use as examples, not on the same level, grown at a much more slower pace, sometimes even contracted, and they've got teams going out of business. So there's definitely question marks over a lot of things. Oh look, Barca, Atletico, and Juve all out the Champions League. Atletico, I'm a bit frustrated there. I don't mind Atletico. A lot of people don't like their style of play, and that's fine. But it's not Real Madrid and Barcelona, so you know, I'd rather PSG fill out the Champions League and Man City, because that will make me chuckle because of all the oil money and the fact that neither club can win it. Um, but I think the fact that those three clubs, and Atletico did pull out of the European Super League, but those three clubs were involved in the European Super League. I think that's called karma. The clubs will only realise when the majority of fans can't afford to go to games. Well, I think we're starting to see that. I think I think we are starting to see um, issues with. I mean, look at the Rugby League World Cup. Now, I know, not. I do know a lot of people on the channel may not be watching the Rugby League World Cup, and that is perfectly fine. But if you look at the highlights package, look at the empty seats at games. Look at the England games; they haven't sold out. Home World Cup in the heartland of the sport, majority of games, Coventry and Newcastle and the Emirates notwithstanding, cannot sell out stadiums. I don't care who's playing. If you can't sell out stadiums that are a lot smaller than football grounds for the most part, there is a problem. But I noticed this back in 2018. And so in the build up to the Rugby League World Cup, New Zealand played three tests against England, and they had games at in Leeds, Hull, and Liverpool for some reason. Anfield. Neither stadium sold out their ticket allocations, and that's back in 2018. So at the time when I was doing my match reviews, going, okay, well we've won the series 2-1. Some young players got to run out. This is 4 years ago. That was a decent performance. Some new players around the squad, that kind of thing. Can't sell out games in rugby league heartlands. I have concerns about this for the World Cup, which was meant to be last year. And those match reviews are still on the channel, so you can watch them and you can hear me going, not selling out Anfield, not selling out the KC Stadium in Hull, not selling out. I think was it Ellen Road or Heading? I think it was Ellen Road because Headingley was having some work done. That was back in 2018. COVID hadn't been a thing. We hadn't had the disaster of Boris Johnson's government, Liz Truss's government, Rishi Sunak, all that kind of crap. We hadn't had the Ukraine war. We hadn't had the cost of living crisis. We hadn't had all the lockdowns. It was 4 years ago. 4 years ago to the week. Okay, and that was designed as a test for the Rugby League World Cup that was meant to take place last year. It's now taking place right now. Couldn't sell out. Couldn't sell out. And I'm thinking to myself, who is in charge of the RFL? Who is in charge of the International Rugby League? Who is in charge of promoting the sport when you're in two heartlands in Leeds and Hull, the two where you've got three of the most successful clubs the game has ever seen in England? Merseyside, St Helens is just down the road, and there's a lot of rugby league fans that do live in Merseyside, and it's a big university city as well. It's a global city, and I'm thinking, who is in charge of promoting this? Where's the advertising? Where's the promotion? Where's the social media promotion? I'm thinking to myself, who's in charge of the game? So I don't think clubs really care. At least they didn't, because at the time, that was 4 years ago. You fast forward 4 years with what's happened, you know, in that 4 year period. We've seen Welsh Rugby Union on its knees going into the last Rugby Union World Cup. Players weren't sure if they were going to have a club to return to play to play at. So rugby union's in a mess. Rugby league, they can't sell out stadiums at a World Cup, even though they've broken some World Cup figures for like attendance. I think not selling out stadiums is not good. Now the quality of players is something separate, but that's a bit worrying. Um, Admittedly, it was delayed by a year, but then you got to look at prices, and prices have changed since last year when I was planning to go to the Emirates semi-final. I was looking at ticket prices; they're more expensive this year, so they've definitely hiked those prices up. The the clubs, I think, did realise how important fans were during the COVID period. The way they dealt with that was wrong. With the Premier League pay-per-view fiasco 2 years ago, remember that? Lasted a month. Lasted a month. There was one game where like 80 odd people paid to watch. Yeah, it was a commercial decision. No, it was backlash from fans saying we are boycotting or illegally streaming. So yes, it was a commercial decision, but I think it was a PR decision going, this is a bad idea. The European Super League, fan power really won the day there because how quickly that fell apart. Clubs are now realising fans are important, more important than they claimed 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So when the channel was in its infancy, they were claiming we weren't as important as we actually are. Um, but the Rugby League World Cup, it's going to be interesting the post World Cup review when they break down the finances and how much money's been made because they actually owe the government money because the government's pumped in some money into the tournament itself. Um, yes, we've broken some attendance figures. It's the best attended Rugby League World Cup that we've had. However, you take those New Zealand, Australia, and England games out, for example, and maybe Samoa Tonga. It's not been. Rugby league is your thing, but I think casual sports fan the competition starts in semi-finals. True, but I would argue this: it's still a World Cup. Now, if you get a nation like America involved, now America has qualified for Rugby League World Cups in the past, but if you were to get a country like America involved, they would want to improve their domestic competition. They would want to invest, and they would want to buy in. Now, one thing that did come out of the COVID pandemic was that the NRL and the AFL were two leagues that started up before a lot other, big international sports leagues did. And the North American audience was bored. And suddenly, obviously with the power of the internet, um, American sports fans stumbled across the AFL and the NRL. So there is an interest in Aussie rules and rugby league in the US and Canada. The fact that the NRL is now actively looking at taking regular season games to the US is very, very interesting. They plan to do this from next season. Now, there's a big debate about the CBA and clubs not being happy with revenue sharing, and there's a potential breakaway competition and all this palaver. The league has just expanded to 17 teams. There's plans within the next 2 to 3 years to get an 18th team in place, maybe as soon as 2024 or 2023 at the earliest. They may even go sod it, we'll get another team in it. It's most likely going to be the North Sydney Bears, but we shall see what happens. Their CBA has started to rumble at this point, and there's been reports coming out that there's a handful of clubs that aren't happy with the revenue sharing, allegedly, and that Peter V'landys and Andrew Abdo have left the UK. They have gone back to Australia to NRL headquarters, and they're sitting down with the Rugby League Players Association and the club representatives, and they are having some crisis meetings. Now, I would think that players would need to be consulted on any collective bargaining agreements. Most of the players are over here in the UK right now. A fair few weren't selected or their teams have already been knocked out, so they've gone back to Australia. Those NRL and Australian based players. So this is a very tense time. I don't think it gets to the point of a rebel breakaway competition. I do think they resolve um, the issues swiftly. I'm not sure when the CBA is up, but there's a lot of contracts in place. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, there is for the casual sports fan. True, although two of the four quarterfinals were quite tasty, New Zealand, Fiji, and Samoa Tonga, um, and a couple of the group games were quite tasty. But I think the well, the, I think there's definitely been a failure on the part of the organisers to make sure that the event was promoted as positively as possible. There's been a lot of discussion both in the domestic media here and in the Australian media and the Kiwi media about a lot of the amount of empty seats, and that is a fair discussion to have. They could have double-headed a lot of the games. The fact that some of the stadiums they're using are also being used by Premier League and Football League clubs right now is a problem. So they're having to share facilities with the EFL and Premier League. So Hmm, we'll see. I don't know which code is in a state either. I think rugby union has got itself in a state for a long time, um, and look, we can argue um, about a lot of things in regards to the state of rugby union right now. There's been a lot of positives over recent years, and also a lot of negatives as well. But a bigger concern for me is the club game in rugby union, and the international game in rugby league is more of a concern. However, these new reports coming out about the revenue sharing and the collective bargaining agreements within the NRL and the Players Association will have to get involved in this, Players Union. Um, we'll see what happens. Well, here's the thing: the with the Rugby League World Cup, which encompasses the women's game as well. So they've got all the World Cups going at the same time, which I believe is fantastic and possibly the best way to grow both the men's and women's games at the same time. And the Women's Rugby Union World Cup, COVID has had an impact with the scheduling. Um, there's been a lot of delays and reschedules and protocols put in place. And then you've got the Football World Cup in Qatar, and I think that's a big one. Um, that's the one that hasn't been rescheduled. I mean, they've moved it from the summer to the winter, but otherwise it's taking place on time. All these other tournaments have had to be tinkered, rescheduled, modified. Some of the start dates changed, some of the venues changed. The Qatar World Cup is actually, apart from when they stated very early on, we're going to make it a winter tournament, and then you've got to schedule around that. Um, there's been a lot of disruption over the last 2.5 years, nearly 3 years now. It'll be 3 years since the world shut down. A lot of disruption. And the sporting world is still playing catch up, which is interesting. So the next Rugby League World Cup is in 3 years' time. The next Rugby Union World Cup is next year. So there's a bit of rejigging, and the women's games have problems, the men's games have problems. Um, and so are there too? I wouldn't say there's too many sports. I would argue that I wouldn't say there's too many sports. I would argue that some sports are better promoted than others and better organised than others. Other sports maybe have too much airtime and are over promoted, and some sports shoot themselves in the foot with um, you know uh, uh, poor player behaviour, poor club administration, international administration being poor, corruption scandal. There's a lot going on. I would argue there's a finite amount of sports fans' money. There's a finite amount of the corporate money. Um, I think some sports are overinflated, like football, and other sports. I think the players are underpaid. I think the infrastructure isn't fixed. I don't. There is no correct answer to that. There's no wrong answer or right answer. I think the League World Cup has suffered with two of the major events being hosted in the same year, being the Women's Euros and the Commonwealth Games. That's a possibility. That is a possibility that a lot of people have decided they've had to make a choice. Now, if the Rugby League World Cup wasn't delayed by a year, and the Women's Euros also, I think, was delayed by a year as well. Um, yes, there has to. I think as if we didn't have COVID, I think the crowd numbers would have been better. I think the viewership figures would have possibly been better, and the whole situation is different. But so much has happened since 2019, 2020 that it's ridiculous at this point. But I do think with the delayed Olympics, the Winter Olympics, all that as well, sports fans have had to cherry pick what they want to watch and what they go and see. I think fans have had to pick a little bit more. Um, I think the Commonwealth Games was under promoted. It was. It didn't seem to have the same impact as previous Commonwealth Games have had. I think that was suffering on the back of the delayed Olympics last year and the Winter Olympics as well. I think that was impacting the Commonwealth Games. I heard a lot of good reports about the Commonwealth Games, but I don't think it had the same impact as, let's say, the Manchester Games did or the Glasgow Games did here in the UK. And on the back of what happened in Australia, I think was it Melbourne or Gold Coast, the last Commonwealths in Australia, got a lot of negative feedback. So the Commonwealth's been under a lot of uh, pressure for a while. Um, the women's Euros, in my opinion, was actually fantastic. Very fantastic. I think that's been a positive. I think that's going to be where your sports personality and team of the year come from. Um, that's been a fantastic achievement. Really has. But looking at things from my perspective, I think this year fans have had to cherry pick what they go and see. They may go to a less event. I mean, bear in mind, since uh, I've been a kid, we've had Euro '96 in this country. We've had the Commonwealth Games in Manchester. We've had the Olympic Games in London. We've had the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow and now Birmingham. We've had a Rugby Union World Cup. We've had two Rugby League World Cups, one of which is currently ongoing. We've had so many major international sporting events tournament-wise. Which have been fantastic. The sporting infrastructure in the UK is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. There is no doubt. We've had the Rugby Union World Cup in Wales that also had some games around the UK. We've had obviously Euro 2020 where Wembley and Hampden Park got some games. It would have been the Rugby League World Cup we played in the summer would have disrupted both the NRL and Super League. That was not viable. It would have caused too much disruption for domestic league competitions. Far too much disruption, and broadcasters and sponsors would have been ripping their hair out. It's always played this time of year. Even in 2017, when that's the Aussie summer, it was played um, this time of year. It's the only slot where all players are available. State of Origin's being played. The mid-season tests. I mean, it's the way the calendar works. So it's player availability. You bear in mind you've got players' unions. You've got to get involved. You've got to have stadium availability as well, um, and the logistics. Um, so that's the Rugby Union World Cup in 2015 had brilliant crowds. Immediately, slightly earlier, so September, October, and into November because it's obviously a bigger tournament. But again, circumstances surrounding the tournament, like the economic and political circumstances and COVID and all that, situation's different. A lot's happened since 2015 when we had the Rugby Union World Cup. A lot has happened since we had the Glasgow Commonwealth Games and the Manchester Commonwealth Games in the last 2 decades and the Olympics a decade ago. So you have to look at, as I say, and I'm going to reiterate this is the list of major international sporting events outside of things like the F1 and Wimbledon and MotoGP, for example, we have had in this country. We've had the World Championship Athletics, we've had Euro 96, we've had the Women's Euros last year, we've had 3 Commonwealth Games, an Olympics, 2 Rugby League World Cups and a Rugby Union, 2 Rugby Union World Cups as well, if you count Wales, which I do. In the UK. That is a lot. So we've got the World Championship Ice Hockey Group. Is it Group A, which is the one below the top tier in Nottingham next year? So we have that. You think about all these major international sporting events that we've had in the UK. That is a lot. That is a lot in 2.5 decades. Um, and it's only been in more recent years that crowd numbers have been falling. And if you take COVID out of it, it's still an actual trend. It's a trend at regular season games. It's a trend at group games and tournaments. I would say ticket price is a problem. I would say transport infrastructure, not stadium infrastructure, is a problem. And the fact that more people now have access to not only mainstream but also social media, um, and the broadcasting as well. When I was a kid in the 90s and the 2000s, um, social media wasn't a thing. Mobile phones, not everyone had a mobile phone. Although I did when I was about 10 or 11, I got my first mobile. But the point stands is that to access, not every game was broadcast on the TV outside of major tournaments. So yeah, and yeah, you got the Cricket World Cup and the Women's Euro. I mean, look how we could list off so many, so many. I think we've had the Women's Rugby Union World Cup as well. I mean, you list off, and I'm just this is off the top of my head. This is not, you know, um, trying to be facetious. Um, so yeah, at a certain point, the sports market, the actual domestic market, goes, hang on, we're forking out money every 3 to 4 years here, because between Euro '96 and the Commonwealth Games in 2000, that's a 5 year, 6 year period. Then you have the Women's Euro 2005, that's 3 years. And then you see how often major international sporting team tournaments are being thrown in there, Olympics and Commonwealth. That's almost a major international sporting event every couple of years. And then in this year, we've got the Commonwealth, Women's Euros, and the Rugby League World Cup all taking place in the same year. That is ridiculous. So yes, we are bidding for a lot of tournaments. We are bidding for the 2028 Euros? Yeah, 2028 Euros, which is fine. I completely understand that. And there has to come a point where, yes, the market saturation is a thing, but I think it's market fatigue. Market fatigue. We already have some great domestic competitions where fans will just go. So yes, we have the rugby league, we have the rugby union, ice hockey, football, F1, domestic motorsport, so British superbikes. You've got the British touring cars, you've got the TCR, British TCR competition, which is the secondary touring car competition. So we've got some great domestic sport leagues and sports competitions. Fantastic. Fans will go to that. These big international sporting events and Champions League finals and Heineken Cup finals in rugby union, and the Challenge Cup and the Super League Grand Final have seen their lowest attendances in a very long time. Fact. And that's been a trend since before COVID. So let that sink in. But yes, so we've had these. We have the domestic competitions that we always have at club level and team level with motorsport and cycling and all that. That's fine. But I think market fatigue is catching up. And then you've got to factor in these overseas Major League Baseball and NFL games that are coming here and the cost of tickets. There is a thing called market fatigue. Um, there is a thing called market fatigue. It's starting to wear thin on a lot of people. I think the novelty of the NFL, and I think the Major League Baseball is going to struggle. I do. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I think it's going to struggle. Um, the Olympics. I mentioned the Olympics, but yeah, we're not including the F1, Wimbledon, MotoGP. Occasionally, the World Rally Championship still turns up. Yes, we've had European and Europa League. So we've had Champions League and Europa League finals. There comes a point where you get fan stagnation, and then you get fan overwhelmment. I think I think it's a bit of fan fatigue. Quite honestly, I think fans have become financially fatigued, regardless of the cost of living. I think, yeah, there has a that kind of a once in a lifetime moment isn't a once in a lifetime moment anymore because in my lifetime, how many big sporting tournaments have we had? A lot. We've had how many World Cups have we had and European Championships and World Championships have we had? Olympics and Commonwealth. That is a lot in a 2.5 decade period since 1996. We've had a lot, and I do think there is that market fatigue. I wouldn't say it's oversaturated, but it's definitely fatiguing the fan bases because yes, basketball wants to grow its sport, ice hockey wants to grow its sport. Everyone wants to grow their sport, and we've heard a lot about this thing called the Olympic legacy. We've heard a lot about um, leaving a post-championship legacy for the Women's Euros, for example, and the Rugby League World Cup, for example. And in certain aspects, yes, the Copper Box Arena has been used for the wheelchair rugby league, which is fantastic. It's getting good crowds, which is fantastic. That's something that was built for a tournament, a competition a decade ago, still getting used. So that's fantastic. Yeah, so I did read about the Sepp. I read the article and the interview Sepp Blatter gave, but his reasoning wasn't the corruption and the human rights, was Qatar's too small a country to host it. That's interesting. That is interesting. England had bidded to host the Field Hockey World Cup. It went to the Netherlands and Belgium in the end. I think it's a realistic decision. England isn't ready to support another. I wouldn't say England isn't ready to support another sport because I think field hockey is a great sport. Um, but I think, as I say, there is fan fatigue. And when you have so many large, it's like France is getting a lot of World Cups, rugby union and football and Euros. They've had a lot as well. I think the French are starting to feel that fatigue as well. Um, I'm surprised the Italians haven't tried to go for a rugby union or another football World Cup or a Euros. It's been a while since Italy's hosted a major event. But look what happened to Greece following the 2004 Athens Olympics. It bankrupted the country. So there is that financial impact that the host nation has to pump in. Um, I wouldn't say England isn't ready to support another sport. I would say, or the UK, I would say there is a market fatigue. I think fans are like, look, we're having all these major sporting events, and we've got to cherry pick what we go and see. The Olympics was the highlight of a lot of people's lives. We've had two more Commonwealth Games in the UK since then. Let that sink in. Not only have so in my lifetime we've had three Commonwealth Games, two Rugby League World Cups, two Rugby Union World Cups, two Women's Euros. It starts to really, I would say, negatively impact. I think the French are going to feel the same as us in a couple of years as well. Um, I would see the French with the Rugby Union, Rugby League World Cups in 2 years apart would start to feel that same kind of um, fan fatigue. I would think um, there's got to come a point where the tournaments get shared around. Yes, it's been great for the infrastructure and the investment that a lot of cities have had. Birmingham, Glasgow, London. We've seen a lot of stadium rebuilds and stadium improvements around the UK. So yeah, we've seen some fantastic new improved stadium infrastructure. You know, infrastructure in towns and cities across the UK because of all these bids we've had and all these tournaments we've had, which is fantastic. The new stadium at York, the York Community Stadium, it's a fantastic little stadium. Um, yes, we are hosting it. It's part of the Rugby League World Cup. It's all the like so the partially abled, so the partially able-bodied, you know, the disability Rugby League World Cup, the wheelchair, women's and men's, always called the Rugby League World Cup. So it all comes under one organising committee. So yes, I am fully aware that we have the Rugby League Wheelchair World Cup we are hosting. Yes, fully aware of that. I saw a documentary on it. It's very interesting. But I do think that, yeah, us and the French have had a lot of international tournaments the last couple of decades, and I do think it is starting to catch up with both nations. There's a lot of public money has had to go into building these sporting facilities and backing these bids, and then putting the related infrastructure projects in place to support, and that comes out the public purse and the taxpayer money. So us and the French, yeah, and the French have got the Olympics coming up as well. The people forget the French have got the Olympics coming up in 2024. So they've got two Rugby League World Cup 2023, Rugby Union World Cup in 2023, Olympics in 2024, Rugby League in 2025. So in the next couple of years, in the next 3 years, France is in the same position we've been in for the last 2 decades. The French are in the same position now, and they've been in that position since 1998. The French, actually, no, the French had a Winter Olympics at Albertville in '92, so the French have been doing this for 30 years. So us and the French have been in this position where we are top nations in a variety of sports, and so therefore, you know, true, yes, the French are pretty good hosts. At the same time, they've been dealing with the same issues we've been dealing with since the early '90s, and so us with Euro '96, them with the Winter Olympics in '92, all the way through till now, and then going through into the next couple of years. You look at the amount of games and tournaments the French have hosted as well, and the amount of they've hosted women's Euros, Rugby Union World Cups. They're going to host a Rugby League World Cup, Olympics, Winter Olympics. They're in a similar position to us, and there is a point where how much public money do you spend? How much private sector cash do you get into to build these stadiums and pump money into these infrastructure projects? Um, I disagree, Joe, mate. If it wasn't for Bob, I wouldn't have heard anything about the other than seeing on the telly. Um, um, I mean, look, there are, as far as I'm aware, when I put the hashtag in for the Rugby League World Cup, there's around 500 odd channels or 100 odd channels or something um, that have been covering, and a lot of them are TV, obviously, mainstream media networks that have their rugby league coverage, and so therefore we've got to take that out of it. But uh, there are a fair few YouTubers who are covering the tournament in a variety of aspects. And because this is a multi-sport, multi-discussion channel, thankfully, apart from the FA Cup this weekend just gone, it's pretty much the only tournament till the Football World Cup. And the Football World Cup comes along, and we can debate, the Football World Cup. And I do hope it's going to become a very interesting talking point. I do think it will be. And I do hope the football is of good quality. But what I saw at the Africa Cup of Nations, at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, the football quality mid-season for these players wasn't great. And these are top quality players based in Europe and North America, for example. They were really making basic errors. They were poor. And these are top quality players like Sadio Mane and Mo Salah. They were really not. It wasn't good quality. And I fear the same is going to happen at World Cup. I believe they can, but this Samoa side is going to be different from the Samoa side that we saw on the opening day of the tournament. Um, Completely different Samoa side. They've found confidence. They've beaten their biggest rivals in Tonga in a brutal game. They look far more in tune with each other now. It's a different beast to what it was on match day one. I think the weather conditions are going to be interesting, and selection. Samoa have had a lot of players go down injured, so selection is going to be key. If England win that game, they're in a healthy position because the Kiwis and the Kangaroos, the Aussies, the Kiwis and the Aussies are going to kick lumps out of each other in the other semi final. Um, so a big, two big nations are not going to make the final basically. Um, and New Zealand had a tough match against Fiji, so and the Aussies haven't figured out their best starting 13, they haven't figured out their starting halfback combinations, so that there is that could be a very interesting encounter. Both semi-finals, we could have a very unpredictable um, final. We could have Samoa New Zealand, for example, which would be ridiculous because no one would have betted on that. But people were saying on game day one that Samoa were going to batter England, and England battered Samoa. So predictions are going to have the winner. Um, Great Britain versus Serbia basketball. Again, we're discussing basketball, and apart from some of you guys telling me, I wouldn't have known it's on. Basketball in this country doesn't do a great job of promoting itself. It doesn't. It's one of the poorly promoted sports in the UK. It really fails in regards to promoting itself. Um, so we'll see how we do, but I think the Serbs are going to win. Maybe it's just because of other sports we've hosted this year and they've been successful as well. As I say, market fatigue. I wouldn't say it's saturation, but I do think that the UK as a whole, so England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the UK as a whole, because we've had Commonwealth Games, we've bid for too many sporting events. We've bid for too many tournaments. We've bid for Olympics and Commonwealth Games. I mean, we've overdone it. Um, and the same with the French. Yes, it'd be nice to see the World Cup or the Euros, proper Euros being here as a tournament because we do have the infrastructure. But do we have the energy for it? Do we have the fans? Do fans have enough money for it? Um, um, and while the women's Euros was fantastic and crowd numbers were record breaking, and yeah, since fans have turned up in this Rugby League World Cup because we have broken Rugby League World Cup records, which, to be fair, weren't hard to break. The Commonwealth Games went off without any negativity. It didn't really register in you know with me, probably because I was very busy with work as well. But as I said, from all reports, the Commonwealth Games went off successfully and had a lot of positive feedback. But the COVID pandemic has rejigged the whole sporting calendar. The only thing I think a lot of people are looking at right now is the Qatar World Cup, and a lot of it's been to do with controversy surrounding the build up to that World Cup. And I think an incident's going to happen out there with an LGBT protest or something, a bit of fan disorder maybe, um, and some kind of incident like that, which is then going to cause issues. But we'll see what happens. Do I think Ghana have the best chance coming from Africa for winning the World Cup? I'm looking at how the Africa Cup of Nations was played. I don't think the African sides are going to do very well. Um, quite honestly, I think this could be a quite disappointing World Cup for what the quality on the field we actually see. And I do think you may see a couple of surprises in there as well, what we're not expecting. But that's personal opinion. Until a ball is kicked, we don't know what's going to happen. There's no desire for basketball salary runner after 2012. Yeah. Again, you've got to have grassroots funding. You've got to have sponsorships in place. You've got to have pathways in place. And this is the discussion about the sporting legacies that we're meant to leave behind. Um, Look, it's what 7 years ago we had a rugby union World Cup. here in this country, and two of the biggest clubs in this country have gone bust. So let that sink in. And there's financial problems within the sport in 2022. Um, the women's game has massively come on, which is fantastic. But we're talking about sporting legacies. Yeah, the Olympic legacy that we discussed about, yes, the Copper Box Arena is being used, but not really for high level basketball. The rugby league wheelchair competition's being is using the Copper Box Arena. Um, Women's netball uses the Copper Box Arena, and they get better crowds. So, what does that tell you? Um, but there is a debate about the funding matrix, and yeah, there's no funding because there's no fans and no. I wouldn't say there's no basketball fans, but I do think British basketball doesn't do a great job at, at promoting itself. At the same time, you look at the other sports at a professional semi-pro level that we have in this country, they're much better organised. They've got the local sponsorship and national sponsorship. They've got the TV deals in place. They've got the media rights deals in place with streaming services. And they've got the pathways in place for youth development and community involvement. Um, and yeah, basketball just hasn't. I mean, bearing in mind, you go back to 2012, Twitter started to hit the mainstream in the build up to that Olympics, and a lot of high profile sports stars started to put themselves on Twitter. And I had my first Twitter account back then as well. And I've never really, I don't enjoy using Twitter. Um, and I'm thinking about possibly, as I said, certain aspects of social media. I've got rid of my Snapchat years ago. I barely use my Instagram. I don't take Facebook seriously. I just post memes and my YouTube videos. And Twitter, I have a love hate relationship with it because of Twitter really is the cesspool of humanity. Um, Absolutely. Um, if my life was on it, who wins the Rugby League World Cup? Can I say the final goes to extra time and golden point? I actually think the final could go to extra time and golden point. And I do think we could have a very interesting. I think Samoa have a very good chance of making that final. However, they did cop a 60-point battering in game one, so and they didn't look overly convincing at times in defence against Tonga. So put them under defensive pressure. I'm not sold on them defensively, but in attack they look scary. In the UK, we only have an appetite for certain sports. Um, cricket's on the decline. Cricket's got problems, and we haven't discussed cricket really. Cricket has got a lot of problems, and these problems with cricket have been around for a very, very long time. These aren't new problems, and there are a lot of issues with. I don't think the 100 was very successful this summer. Let's just put that out there. And the ECB are saying that this tournament may break even within the first couple of years. It's going to lose money. And when you've got a star player like Ben Stokes going, I'm pulling out of your new flagship tournament, that doesn't sell it to anyone. Um, I do think that cricket's been on a decline for a very, very long time. The ECB have mismanaged what was a successful sport, and it still is a successful sport in a sense. We've won cricket World Cups, we've won, you know, Test rankings, and we've had some great players, you know, coming through the cricketing systems. But I do think that the governing body has massively mismanaged the direction the sport has taken. over the last 15, 16, 17 years. And, we can discuss some of the commercial decisions the ECB have taken and other cricketing governing bodies and the ICC have taken. We could discuss the impacts competitions like the IPL and the Big Bash, for example, have had upon the game, good and for good and bad. And so I think it's right and fair to say, yeah, cricket. I mean, look at what's happened with the Sri Lankan team in India. There's been allegations of all sorts going on there of a criminal nature. One of the players has been arrested and charged with some sexual offences, and there is an ongoing review into the behaviour of players at the tournament. And so that there is definite discipline issues with players. There is a culture issue within dressing rooms, which is not necessarily um, a healthy, modern, inclusive dressing room culture. Look at the scandals we've seen. Again, in my lifetime, we've seen the match fixing scandal from Hansi Cronje all the way up to what's happening with Sri Lanka in the Australian T20 World Cup right now. Yeah, cricket, I think they have milked the fans too much. And we can discuss the commercial arrangements, the TV rights. And you look at peak viewership figures for the final of the 2019 Cricket World Cup to peak viewership figures in the 2005 Ashes, there's a drop off of around 10 million casual. It's been made less accessible, and a lot of finger pointing and blame needs to lie at the ECB. And we can some of their the TV deal was a blunder, and a lot of people at the time were like, "You're making a massive mistake here." And I think there are those within the sport that are realizing that the 100 is a knee-jerk reaction to 15, 16, 17 years of declining viewership figures and declining revenues within the sport, and declining uptick with young players coming through. And this isn't just an ECB problem, this is a global problem. Cricket Australia is finding it's got a lot of issues within its structures. The IPL has got a lot of corruption allegations labelled against it. There's a lot of problems within the sport. The sport is badly governed. So we'll see what happens with cricket. But yeah, I do believe it is a bit of a cash cow, especially on the ECB side of things. It's like the Ashes every 2 years now. The Ashes has lost all magic as a contest. It used to, as a kid growing up, watching the Ashes was like, this is like once every 4 years. This is important. It's back-to-back Ashes tours, done. Oh, I mean, there's a couple of cricket clubs near to me. There's one right down the road actually, and I have seen one of their club matches, which was interesting. Yeah, is the test are test crowds as healthy as they could be? Uh, the domestic structure is a mess. It's the same in Australia; it's a mess as well. So a lot of countries, the domestic structure is not healthy. Um, yeah, but I do think poor governance has led to a lot of problems. And then you've got to look at player ill discipline, and that is something that is still an issue. Um, Player ill discipline has been a problem for a long, long time. High profile players have been caught doing silly, silly things, which damages the gentlemanly image of the sport. I wouldn't say we get thrashed all the time. Unfortunately, I think the Aussies are feeling this as well. A lot of Australians feel this as well. Is that the magic isn't there anymore? It's overplayed. They've milked the cash cow, and so it's lost a lot of its magic and appeal. And Australian cricket's had its own scandals to deal with and its own culture issues to deal with um, internally. So there's a fair bit to think about when it comes to cricket. Cricket has a lot of head scratching to do and soul searching to do in regards to the direction the sport wants to take itself. I would say the 2005 Ashes was the best um, across the UK and Australia. Had the best viewership figures internationally um, outside of the UK and Australia. Um, yeah, cricket's like baseball, and cricket is like baseball, aging fan base. It's lost that connection with younger fans, hence why the hundred's been thrown in there. But it has lost that connection with bringing younger fans through uh, and keeping younger fans interested in the sport. And but baseball's had the same issues. And we've discussed Major League Baseball this time last year in the build up to the lockout. And yeah, baseball's got the same problems. The surveys have proven that it's an aging fan base, a shrinking fan base. Younger fans are definitely tuning out. The younger demographics aren't interested in the sport. They don't find it exciting or they don't find it engaging. Um, it's definitely there is clearly a disconnect between the generations. And and then when you hear about all these negative things coming out with the sport and culture issues, and it's not just an England problem. It's cricket in general has this problem. This is not just um, an ECB issue or an England issue. This is a global problem. Is the fan base is switching off, and young fans, fan, even the older fans, switching off. There is a disconnect between the governing body and the fans, the sport and the fans. There's definitely something's going wrong. Oh, I wouldn't say to a certain extent. I think yes, subcontinental Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, you know, first, second, third generation. Yes, that they love the sport. Um, but they make up a proportion of the population. They can't sustain the sport by themselves. There's not enough of them. And you have to look at it in regards to market share to other sports and then grassroots clubs as well. So your rugby leagues, your rugby unions, your footballs, um, and you know community engagement, school engagement. So through the education system, cricket isn't played in state schools at the same level it is in private schools. There's definitely that class divide. And then you've got to look at club facilities, and they're not uniformly the same across the country for standard and quality and facilities. And yeah, I mean, and not every kid's going to find cricket interesting. You're not going to convert every kid or family to cricket fans. Not every family is a football. Not every fan's rugby. Not every fan's either. So you're going to find certain people will find more sports interesting than others. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been a massive cricket fan. I've played the sport. I enjoy watching the sport. I find watching the sport relaxing. Um, but At the same time, the sports that I enjoy the most are the more physical team sports, like your ice hockeys and your rugby leagues. I find them more appealing to watch, and that's my personal point of view. That we look at this, I look at the chat, I look at the, the comment sections, and I look at um, surveys I've done on the channel for like what um, sports people like, and you get a mixed response. But when I put up, what content do you guys want to see more of? I put Major League Baseball up there, and I know that some of my moderators and viewers are baseball fans, and they were like, "We're not interested in baseball anymore." So let that sink in. Question: is there any scope for an English Premier League of cricket, say top 8, 10 counties breaking away from the establishment, get a TV deal? Isn't that what the 100 is? Except with the establishment backing. Um, the T20 Bash is a shambles. Rebel, as I say, rebel tours or rebel leagues or rival leagues that just start spring up tend to fail without official backing, even with the money being pumped in. That's the last thing sport needs is further division, because it could risk really bankrupting it, and causing lasting um, lasting damage that's irreparable, in my opinion. Um, Definitely the last thing the sport needs at this time. But the idea needs to be put out there that we need to look at how we structure the domestic game. I don't think that the 100 is not the solution, not the solution at all, because it is a money pit. And yeah, it's made up teams and it's a money pit. And the ECB's admitted, even without COVID, it was going to lose money in the first 2 years. And the ECB got a government loan to survive, so let that sink in. So they're wasting money basically on the 100. And I do feel that that is not the solution. That is a symptom of the disease that the ECB has caused, which is greed. And it is a knee jerk, it's a reactionary idea that's been badly thought out, that's been pushed through against the will of a large amount of fans. And when you've got one of your most high profile players in Ben Stokes pulling out of the competition, that's not going to sell your product to fans when your main marketing asset that you have doesn't want to play. And fans are feeling that disconnect. They are. And I can completely understand. But we do need to have a discussion about how we, and I think a lot of it's to do with free to air coverage. TV. It's proven to work for lesser sports. It's proven to work. Cricket is the prime example of free to air coverage working in growing the fan base and growing participation and in growing interest. So the women's Euros back that up as well with massive TV, better than expected TV figures. So I don't know what the ECB is doing, but they're not doing their market research. And what I'm seeing is a reactionary idea to fooling basically less customers. So if it's a company, think of this just as a standard company. The SPL, I'm assuming we're talking the Scottish Premier. We're talking Scottish football, right? I've done my videos on the SPL over my time. I've done club history videos. I've looked at the SPL league table at times. I've got a lot of Scottish viewers who over the channel's history have popped in and out. I think Scottish football is in the same situation as English cricket, and a lot of it's to do with poor governance and commercial decisions are taken that haven't helped the game. And And looking at the failures of both Celtic and Rangers in Europe this season, catastrophic failures. Considering Rangers were in a European final at the end of last season and could have won some silverware, is stunning, absolutely stunning. How the game in Scotland has declined over the last 30 years. It's ridiculous, really. And in that time, Rangers have had two European finals. Um, um, it's ridiculous. Well, look, I don't know enough about the governance side of the Scottish FA and the Scottish League, Scottish Professional Football League, and that such. But I've heard Nigel Doncaster is one of the more hated sports officials in the world, one of the more disliked um, people in charge of sports governance there is. But I don't know enough about the governance structures in Scottish football. I don't know enough about um, the relationship between the clubs and the Scottish FA and Celtic in 2003. What happened to Celtic in 2003? Generally, I was what, 14 at the time, 13, 14 at the time. It's 19 years ago. It's a long time ago. I was a kid. Making me feel old. I had my second mobile. I think it was on my second or third mobile phone at the time. It was like a Nokia. What was I? What phone did I have? I had a Nokia 3310. I think it was my second 3310 at the time. It might have been a 3330. Wow. Was it an 8310? I had a Nokia at the time. I had a small Scandinavian mobile phone at the time. Um, oh, bloody hell. Oh, look. The fact that Scottish football has declined as it has. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I didn't even have a smartphones when a thing the last time. Uh, what's happened over the last? What's happened to the production line? Any number of reasons. I think a big part of it's the UEFA coefficient, because that actually hampers the smaller European leagues. The structure of the Champions League, Europa League, and now it's Europa Conference League. The lack of the Cup Winners' Cup. Um, that was a big draw card for Scottish clubs to do well in Europe and get to the latter stages, and players to you know get that um, exposure on a more global scale. Um, Something's happened though over the last, I'm going to say 20, 25 years. Something has definitely happened in the quality of players that come out of Scottish football. And I think there are two key moments that define Scottish football's finances in the last two and a half decades, and that's the collapse of ITV Digital, so the original ITV Sport channel, and the collapse of Setanta. And they happened a handful of years apart. And that had a massive knock on effect financially on the Scottish game that it's never fully recovered from. That has obviously impacted Rangers and has definitely weakened the club game in Scotland over the last 12, 14 years. But the decline was there from the late 90s with players coming through. And a lot of that is to do with the structures of the European competitions and the UEFA coefficient. It definitely is damaging to some of the non-Big Five leagues, so to speak. It's definitely damaging. Zenit only won 2-0 in the Europa League final in 2008 or 3-0. I watched that game live in a pub. Um, are there any sports that could grow in England or in the UK? I think what we're seeing is not is market fatigue, not saturation. I think we've had too many major sporting tournaments in a short space of time for the sports market to absorb. Um, my dad used to play for Dorchester, so Bracknell Town is now playing Sandhurst, but I used to live a stone's throw from their old ground. Um, literally, I could on match nights or match days, I could hear the stadium. So if they had a Friday night game, I could hear the stadium. And my dad used to play for Dorchester Town back in the day, before he joined the army. So there you go. There's the link there. The irony. Um, the as I said, I think we've reached market fatigue, not saturation. I think if we'd spaced out some of these major sporting events we had over the last 25, 30 years, um, ironically, I think sports could grow better. I think we've had so many major sporting events since the mid 90s in the UK that it's reached a point where we as people are exhausted by it, quite frankly. Um, the interesting one, Dorchester versus Weymouth. So my granddad uh, lived in Dorchester, passed away. Now he was cremated in Weymouth, which is round the corner from the football ground, the crematorium, and we had the funeral wake at the clubhouse at Dorchester Town. Let that sink in. Um, I would say cycling's had some good growth. Road cycling's had good growth, and velodrome indoor cycling um, has had some good growth even before the 2012 Olympics. Motorsport, we've got a lot of really class um, motorsport venues around the country. There's potential for more growth there. Um, but I think we've reached, as I say, market fatigue. No, we have. That's my personal opinion. Women's rugby union, rugby league, and football, yes, could there's the possibility to continue to grow it, um, but at the expense of what? Let that sink in, because as I say, I do think we've reached a market fatigue, not saturation, fatigue. I think if we stop bidding for tournaments and focus on our domestic infrastructure and domestic funding, and I think we could see more sustained, slower but more sustained growth, because I think a lot of sports have grown too quickly, and what we're seeing now is the aftermath of growing too quickly. I wouldn't say sport is in decline. I think what we've seen is some sports have overextended themselves um, uh, too rapidly in certain aspects. Rugby union, rugby league, I think on the men's side of things have definitely overextended themselves. Football's overextended itself. Um, so I don't think any sport will go extinct. I think kids will still play. I think amateurs will still play. People will still participate at school and university and at grassroots level clubs. But I do think certain sports have grown too fast, too quickly, and overextended themselves. And the support structures are not in place to sustain the speed of growth. And I think part of the problem with that is the amount of international sporting tournaments we've had. And which sports into like cricket's at a crossroads. I think rugby union and rugby league are at a crossroads as well. I think these are defining moments. These next couple of years will define the direction both sports take. Um, I think football has also reached a crossroads as well. And I think that when I say growth, the wage growth, the transfer growth, the overvaluation, the financial growth, for example, has been ridiculous, and hasn't matched the general economy, hasn't matched. It's unsustainable. I would much rather see slow and steady, sustained growth over ridiculous, massive spikes and troughs, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing unsustainable growth that growing too rapidly without putting the support structures in place and the sporting infrastructure in place for the long term sustainability. Um, Houston Astros winning the World Series. Baseball doesn't interest me really. I just cover it for the channel. Um, I think there'll be a lot of question marks over the Astros considering the sign stealing scandal. I don't think they fully, over the last 3-4 years, um, gained their respect back with other teams, fans. I think there's still that asterisk against them. There's still that question mark over the culture of the team and who knew what. Um, but there we go. Yeah, rugby league has overextended itself, and with problems at the professional level, that will have a knock-on effect to the semi-pro and amateur and school and university levels as well, because the pathways. And while the university game has always had a good following as an amateur, semi-pro kind of level, and the associated clubs that go with that, um, the professional game has definitely been mismanaged for a long time. And it's not just an English problem; it's or a UK problem. This is a global problem, and it's going to have knock-on impacts. I wouldn't say athletics is declining. I just think the way the Tokyo Olympics went down, and the feelings of athletes and the broadcasters were like, we don't want to be here. Um, but every generation has that one athlete. But I do think the amount of doping scandals in athletics, I wouldn't just say it's declining in the UK. I think it's a declining sport in general. I think the amount of doping scandals and cheating scandals and corruption scandals we've had within the sport, of track and field over the years has definitely damaged its image, um, quite frankly. And a lot of big names have retired as well, all roughly at the same time. So we'll see that. Declining wise, I think rugby league is at a crossroads. I think this World Cup is crucial, and if we win the World Cup, it might reverse the decline a little bit. But I think it's the governing body that's causing a lot of the problems. I don't think it's the players. I don't think it's the fans. I think it's the governing body that's mismanaged the sport horrifically for a long time. And again, the TV deal was a big part of that. So the RFL and Super League governing bodies need to look at themselves and go, are we governing the sport in the right way? Golf is in a mess. Golf is not the sport it was. And I think the greed of golf is killing it, and it's turning people off. Um, and cricket, cricket, cricket's in a mess. Kids will still play it. Adults will still play it. Local cricket clubs will still play. Uh, Amateur grassroots clubs will still play. Certain state schools and private schools will still play. And the sport will still be played. It just needs to reset itself and figure out what its structures should be. Yes, they've expanded the London series to Germany as well now. I'm not sure all the players are happy with playing these games. The NFL has committed itself to global regions. So certain teams will have certain regions they go to, like Australasia, like Australia, New Zealand, South America, Africa, uh, Europe, etc., etc. The NFL has plans on the table. How sustainable that is for the NFL long term, I don't know. I don't know how sustainable that is for the NFL long term. Yeah, cricket, unfortunately, yes, is one of those sports that corruption in cricket, with the money that's been thrown around in cricket with things like the IPL, for example, and the Big Bash and the T20 competitions. Yes, cricket and corruption, unfortunately, are there. But it's got to deal with its problems, and it's not. But neither's golf. Golf has gone down this LIV, PGA, DP Tour battle ground. It's basically Greg Norman versus the PGA because Greg Norman doesn't like the PGA. There you go, he fell out with them. So this is an ego trip, and I think it's definitely put off a lot of fans. The greed shown by players, the tour organisers. American football, I think with American football we've reached fatigue with that. There's only so far you can grow it, and they're now taking one of the games in the UK to Germany now. It used to be 4 games in the UK. Now it's 3 games in the UK, one in Germany. Speedway's dead. Speedway is very popular in Poland, but it's pretty much dead here because it was the running costs of the stadiums, which Speedway tracks, also dog tracks, dog racing tracks, and dog racing's dead as well. So Speedway is gone. That's one of the motorsports, one of the sports that has unfortunately gone by the wayside in this country. People still participate in it, but not at the same level. Um, yeah, a lot of people do see golf as one of those elitist sports, middle to upper class sports. Um, I've worked at a golf course. I understand that stereotype. Unfortunately, it's a unfortunate stereotype. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, it's doing well in Germany, not the UK. But look what happened with the last time we had NFL Europe. It did fail. Um, while it may be doing okay in Germany for now, you've got to remember how many US military personnel are based in Germany still. So there is that, and the amount of American businesses that do business in Germany. Yes, it will do well for now, but again, I don't know how sustainable the NFL's plans for its international series long term are going to be. I really don't. Uh, yeah, look, Speedway, as I say, Speedway has been in trouble for a long time in this country. Um, long time, but it's very popular in Poland. Again, it's TV, money, sponsorship, uh, running costs, whole variety of things, insurance, um, a whole load of reasons why. Um, yeah, tennis is one of them where I think you know it's definitely a very niche sport. Um, and we'll see what happens with tennis. We've had we've been blessed with a lot of decent players in the last 10 to 15 years that are British in both the men's and women's. So we have been blessed by the quality that has now come through because of Tim Henman basically inspiring a lot of people to play. When I was a kid, Tim Henman is the reason why we have an Andy Murray. Is the reason why we have Jamie Murray. It's the reason why we have all these female players and Evans and others in the game and Norrie and all that. It's because of Tim Henman nearly winning Wimbledon, but other players like Andy Murray have gone on to bigger and better things. Thursday's England semi. We're talking rugby union here, or rugby league, because England rugby league women's final group games are. Oh, cricket? No, I'm not waking up for that. I'll be watching the women's rugby league matches tomorrow and Thursday, and then Friday I don't know what I'm doing, and then Saturday and Sunday is the men's rugby league semi-finals, and then the women's and men's tournaments wind down next week. Um, MMA, UFC, and Bellator and other promotions. I've got a love-hate relationship with the martial arts. I think MMA is not true martial arts. Martial arts are meant to be self-defense and all about discipline and respect, and I don't see any discipline and respect with MMA. I just see legalized violence. That if you were to do that on a Friday night, you're spending a lot of not more than just a night in cells. You're getting charged with some serious offences and going to prison for a long time. Um, I've got friends who practice martial arts and who are, coach martial arts, dojos and things like that, like, various martial arts. I think MMA is an aberration. It's not true what martial arts are meant to be. Martial arts are meant to be self-defense. They're meant to teach discipline and respect. And what I see is brutality, lack of discipline, and lack of respect. Um, quite frankly. It's just legalised violence. And while you can appreciate the training, the effort put in to get in the octagon, um, yeah, some of the antics, some of the high profile UFC and Bellator fighters just brings the sport into disrepute. Um, and yeah, I just can't get behind it. Well, a few years ago, I had a bit of interest, but unfortunately, it's not it's not something that I can invest in and get behind, because it's not teaching discipline, it's not teaching respect, it's not teaching self defense. It's just thuggery, really. Um, the Yeah, the Ben boxing, the Ben Eubank. Um, yeah, that is boxing's been brought to disrepute. But boxing's been made to be a laughing stock with all these exhibition fights with you know Jake or Logan Paul and Psy and some of these rugby league players masquerading as boxers in Australia. Boxing's become farcical over the last 5, 10 years. Um, quite frankly, and boxing's become a bit of an embarrassment, really. That's my personal opinion on that. But yeah, the boxing and MMA is farcical, really. There's no overall governing body. Um, so yeah, that's my personal opinion on that one. Yeah, I don't know how many followers I've actually got now. I think when I started the stream, I had 968. So we'll see how many I have when we've ended the stream. Like, yeah, I want this mullet to go. This I want. I actually now starting to hate my long hair. It's just a mess every day. It's starting to get tangled up. I want this hair gone. I want to shave it off. Um, I have to have it in a ponytail at work now, which is embarrassing. Um, but no, in regards to some sports have definitely gone down a skin fade. No, I want to have full skin head. All this is going. Last time I had a haircut was nearly 2.5 years ago, and I had the full skinhead. I had the whole thing shaved off, and it took a while. And 20 quid later, and my hair was hey, you're bald. Um, I wouldn't say it's amazing. It's still legal. I think the problem is you've got four different governing bodies. You've got I think five different belts to become unified world champion in every weight division. Um, you've got the boxing board of control in every country, so you can have a license revoked in the UK, which Ben has, but he could have it approved in the US, for example. Some of the promoters is pure greed, which is why I refuse to get pay per views. There's a lot of issues um, right now with the sport. Like any sport where you're deliberately banging someone else in the head repetitively is not healthy for you. Um, and look, you know, look what happened to Muhammad Ali. Um, yeah, they've got so many weight divisions now. It's farcical. Um, I think the sport is definitely boxing and MMA are two sports that I think have got a lot of problems that they don't want to admit to. They do not want to admit to the issues that these sports have. Um, and like I don't know what else. As I say, there's no uniform global governing body. You've got IBO, WBO, WBA, the other one. Oh, there's still the underground MMA unlicensed, and it's all over YouTube and Facebook. You can find their pages. They don't even shy away from the fact that these are illegal, unlicensed martial arts leagues. Um, there's films glorifying it, um, and that's basically what UFC, Bellator, and other martial art, mixed martial art promotions are. Um, that they are legalized forms of violence, and yeah, they are growing sports, but at what cost? Because you're basically battering people in the head, and you look at some of the underground promotions which are purely illegal because there's no fight insurance. If you get bashed badly and you need to go to hospital, you are fucked. And I've seen some horrific knockouts in some of these underground promotions. Um, a lot of it's to do with older players with the old heavier balls before we got these lightweight ball designs that we've had over the last 25, 30 years. But yeah, no, boxing and MMA, I mean, we're asking kickboxing. Yeah, you know, constantly take blows to the head. It's a no-brainer. Bashing your head a lot doesn't do your head any good. And I'm talking about the fact that I've had concussions. Bashing your head a lot is not good for you. You know how bad um, yeah, it doesn't take a genius to go, banging your head's not good for you. It's like constantly breaking your arm is not good for you. It's like if you constantly have repeat injuries, it's like, you know what, call it a day. Um, do I prefer the Fiji him or Kiwi haka? Where you got the Civi Tau and the Sippy Tau, Tonga and the Fijians also have their own version of a haka kind of war dance as well, which they have done in the past. It's just for some reason recently they've done their pre-match hymn. But uh, they used to do their, I forget the name of it. Their not haka, but their war dance, uh, traditional pre-match war dance. And for some reason, in recent years in rugby league, they've decided to go with the pre-match hymn. The Cook Islands one's quite tasty as well. That's another Maori haka, haka. Um, I don't know. I think for me, I'm open to it. I'm neither for the hymn or the haka for me. Um, Chris Benoit. I was growing up at the time, and well, I was 17 at the time, and obviously Eddie Guerrero was my favourite wrestler, and he was very very good friends with Chris Benoit. And of course, you got Jericho and Chris Jericho and all that also being and Edge and Christian and all that were also pretty good friends with Eddie Guerrero. And of course, his death was quite sudden and unexpected. Um, and had an impact on that industry. What we now know about Chris Benoit is other wrestlers were like, "Hang on, man! I mean, this is the Attitude Era. We are pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, on TV at the time slot we have, and we are pushing the boundaries of entertainment. We're not comfortable with constantly bashing our heads." And and Chris Benoit was one of those that was really pushing the boundaries of what basically was ECW and things like that, the extreme wrestling side of things that TNA and other promotions picked up. And he was willingly taking chair shots to the head long after other wrestlers were like, "Yeah, no, I've been to the doctor. I've had a few concussions." And this is at the roughly at the time that the CCE was being figured out with the NFL. The NFL was that the scientist that Will Smith played was doing his research, and so there was already rumors about this new disease, this new illness that they were discovering in regards to repeated head trauma. And they were like, "Hang on a sec, Chris, we need to slow some of this stuff down." And he didn't. And yeah, after what happened, the murder, suicide, or whatever, there's other conspiracies that other people were involved. But what happened in 2007. The He was what? He was 30. I think he was like 37 years old. He died. He had the brain of a 90-year-old who had really advanced Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Um, his head was like Swiss cheese. He was really in a bad state. Um, and he was clearly deteriorating quite rapidly with his mental state. Now, obviously, the CTE lawsuit and the CTE um, research has accelerated since then, and we now know that other sports are facing huge lawsuits, which I think is unfair. But yeah, Chris Benoit did some. He really, and I think what we're going to see with the Hardy Boys, Jeff Hardy is another one who I think is we're going to see. I mean, look at his addiction issues that he's had. I mean, he's on the drink and the drugs all the time. He's another one that I think is going to be die young, and we're going to find out that his brain is melted Swiss cheese. Um, Scrambled eggs is another thing I've heard. That's my fear. Is some of these wrestlers and MMA fighters, we're going to find out that they truly are got scrambled eggs up there. And they may be completely decent people away from the sport, away from sports entertainment, and very engaging with the fans, very respectful, and they're going to die young. They're going to deteriorate very, very rapidly. And as seen with Phil Green, the rugby league coach, he was an ex rugby league player. He seemed to be quite happy and okay when he was Queensland coach in at the end of last season, 2021. Within 6 7 months, and it was very very quick. And when they did the autopsy, he had the worst case of CTE ever seen in Australia, and he wasn't a big player. He you know yeah, I've seen the Paul Hyman heckler and he goes, I don't give a, and he goes, I don't care about that. He did what he did. Um, yeah, but when you've got people within sports industries or sports entertainment like wrestling who have their views and we can and James Graham had his say over the last 12 to 18 months in the media in Australia, the rugby league player. Um, and controversial as they were, I think he was right to hey, he's still educating himself. And he went to have a brain scan and he's been told he's had mild brain damage. Now, whether he's had a mild stroke and doesn't realise or he's actually damaged his brain while playing, he still went to have a scan on his own choice. So while he's still mentally with it, he's gone to get it checked out. Um, but when you've got people like Paul Hyman, high profile within the wrestling industry, and we're not talking Olympic wrestling, we're talking professional wrestling, which is sports entertainment. Olympic wrestling is still a sport. But when you've got high profile people like that within an industry where concussion is a big thing and athlete welfare is a big thing. And I do call them athletes because a lot of them have been NFL players or rugby players or boxers or done other sports at collegiate, amateur, professional level before going into pro wrestling. And there is a lot of gym work involved and a lot of physicality involved with what they do. Um, when you've got figures like that who are not denying it, but are talking it down or not. Hmm, well, yeah, well, that's my personal opinion. We do need to have a bit of a conversation about, yeah, okay, if you are going to be competing in a contact sport like rugby league, NFL, ice hockey, you need to sign an insurance waiver. But at the same time, these professional sports and pro wrestling need to look after their former players and former athletes with welfare funds properly. It's all they need to, I think, pay for their care, um, put and their medical bills. I think they need to actually, yeah, even if the players don't require it, I think that fund needs to be available for all players to have a decent standard of living. And we can mitigate this. Concussions are going to happen, but I do think we need to put protocols in place to look after ex-players. Well, looking good, looking after the future and current players with the protocols getting stricter and stricter. But we need to look after the players that have gone before, who have retired, and support them with medical and care costs, even if they and make sure they are looked after. Um, Recent outrage of Qatar, a lot of fans in a lot of countries have made their views known. I think the TV viewership and fans going over there are going to be a lot less than anticipated. I think the TV viewership is going to be poor and it's going to be telling. Um, Muhammad Ali's decline. You look at some of his last interviews as a fighter, and I think he was in the late 70s, early 80s. He's already gone. He's gone mentally long before he's sad passing. He was declining years before um, he retired. You could physically see it. Um, it was the same with Joe Frazier as well. George Foreman has shown signs. A lot of them have shown signs of the brain injuries and what is CTE, and early onset Parkinson's and early onset dementia. So yeah, let that sink in. But that's all again hindsight and wishful thinking. But if you look at some of Muhammad Ali's last interviews before his last couple of fights, you can definitely see there's a slowing down mentally. And at the time, people didn't pay much attention. But looking with hindsight and now what we do know about head injuries, you can say actually he should have stopped fighting 5, 10, 15 years earlier. Something is clearly wrong. He's not well. And you can see it in the ring as well with his in ring performances. He's done, but it's very visible just before he retires and just after some of his interviews and press conferences and when he's meeting fans. You can definitely, at the time, people didn't realise. It's when you look back with hindsight, you could see there's definite warning signs of and symptoms of early onset dementia and Parkinson's, which he ultimately at the end suffered with, and the signs were there for a good 10, 15, 20 years. It is what it is, and well, it's the same with any. You, looking at with Bobby Charlton right now, he's been showing signs for several years that he's had dementia or Parkinson's. He's been showing for a long time. He's had the shape a good 5, 10 years that he's not been at the peak of his mental powers. That he and it was the same with Nobby Stiles. Um, the more we now know about the symptoms and signs to look out for with head injuries and then post concussion syndrome and the related Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and stuff. Hindsight's terrifying. And there's a few other. It's uh, the former Welsh captain, rugby union player, recently um, diagnosed with early onset dementia. He's 40. Yeah, let that sink in. Um, Steve Thompson, rugby union player, who won the 2003 World Cup. Um, he doesn't remember half his career. Now, you can put that down to poor tackle technique, which a lot of players do have, and what we now know um, about head knocks. Um, Lewis Moody was another one who had a lot of concussions. Dylan Hartley, I remember in when was it? It was in a Six Nations game. He was absolutely polax. I think it was 2018, and it was England won the Six Nations or the Triple Crown or something, or the Calcutta Cup. It was one of those kind of games, and he's lifting the trophy at the end of the game. And he doesn't remember. I think Steve Thompson. Steve Thompson's an interesting one. Um, his tackle technique was never great, and I do say this as someone who played at amateur level in that school and grew up watching Steve Thompson play. Um, and when we were taught to tackle, his tackle technique was absolutely shocking. A lot of them are like Lee Halfpenny. I'm surprised he's still playing. The amount of concussions he's had, and George North. It's sad when an ex-player goes, "Oh, I wish I'd never played insert sport." Now, I have some sympathy for Steve Thompson's position. I do. Unfortunately, there's a lot of players from his era, from the early professionalism era, especially. Um, from like the early professional era, from the mid 90s to the mid 2000s. So his era when he was playing. That's where a lot of these players who either came through in that era or retired in that era when the game went pretty professional, having a lot of these head injury problems. Um, and since then, one that stands out for me, one of my favourite players, same age as me actually, is Pat Lambie. Very noticeable when he has his head knocks and his early retirement, and how he's not the same as confident as a player. Um, that's quite an interesting one. Rugby league wise, there's been quite a few. Um, Boyd Cordner and Jake Friend for the Sydney Roosters over the last couple of years. Um, Absolutely, you can see, especially Jake Friend had a lot of concussions, but Boyd Cordner is the one where simple little like that, little knocks, he's going down. Um, Kalen Ponga at the end of this, I mean, Kalen Ponga should be in the Australian squad, for example, or even the New Zealand team as well, because he can play for both. Um, his last concussion midway through last season, this year, was innocuous. Your average tackle, he slightly banged his head on the ground. We're talking gently. Um, your average, and he was out, failed the protocol. And I watch a lot of rugby. I watch a lot of ice hockey as well. And again, I've seen players who don't look, and I've watched players throughout their careers, and you see them as time goes on, spending more time on the sidelines, not playing, reduced minutes. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, I wouldn't say all the rugby players in the scrum have too much head contact. But the cauliflower is just the rubbing of the cartilage when you're in the scrum. It's just the rubbing. That's not to do with bashing your head. That's actually when your ears rub back and forth. And not every player in the scrum gets cauliflower ears, thankfully. Um, that's cartilage damage. That's completely different to bashing your head a lot. However, and I do stress this, scrummaging technique over the last 20 years has gone down the toilet, which is resulting in a lot of neck and shoulder injuries. A lot of neck and shoulder injuries, and head injuries as well. The Rock and the Mall has become. They keep experimenting, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, with these rule variations. Um, every couple of years in a World Cup cycle. Now they haven't done that so much recently with the rule variations, um, which was normally a Super Rugby initiative and driven by the Rugby Championship. That hasn't happened, partly because of COVID. Yeah, James Haskell. I went to school with James Haskell. He is a knob. Not a fan of James Haskell. He's got a. He's. I wouldn't. I'm just not a fan of James Haskell. Um, he's an overgrown man child. But what I will say about James Haskell, he's not wrong. Um, there are some of the ice hockey is a good example. Rugby league is a good example. You're going through multiple what would be multiple car accidents. So, and I've been watching a lot of the old classic V8 supercar races from a couple of years ago, and there's been some big shunts there. And you might have a couple of big shunts in a race. You might go into the tyre barrier, get pulled out, your car maybe patched up, and you have another one. That hurts, and and then you hear about drivers who at the previous race meeting had an accident. Excuse me, broken some ribs, bit of a sore back, broken ribs. Let that sink in. Out of a car crash. Now, bear in mind, motorsport, you're going at a significantly faster rate of speed, but when you being involved in a shunt at 30, 40 mile an hour, it's not particularly pleasant, the forces that are put on your body. They are, and I can attest to that. They're not particularly pleasant. And there's only so much a body can take before, yeah, the shoulders, the knees. I mean, you look at Jacques Berger is one. He was completely rebuilt. Johnny Wilkinson's another. He's been completely rebuilt. Multiple operations. And people go, who's Jacques Berger? The Zimbabwean captain who's played for Saracens. One of the best um, flankers the game has ever seen. And number eight. Sergio Parise, how he managed to play as long as he did is fantastic. I'm surprised Alan Wynne Jones is still playing. Um, but yeah, the contact, absolutely agreed. It's brutal. The the brutality that they put their bodies through. And then there is only so much before, yeah, the body breaks down. It's the same with like power forwards in the NHL, the big hitting forwards who will score a lot of goals, but also physically impose themselves on the opposition. Um, it's like that box to box midfielder in football. Uh, how much running around can you do before your knees are shot? I mean, there are absolutely like, yeah, the question does have to be asked. I think it's a fair question. How much can you put your body through before you're done? And yeah, James Haskell was known to be a bit of a gym monkey, um, and yeah, some massive hits. And I think 5 to 6 is an understatement of the collision. And fans love the collision, and the players love the collision. But there has to come a point where squad rotation, resting players. I mean, you talk to motorsport people when they've had a bad shunt. Sometimes they're not medically cleared to race for 2 or 3 race meets because of the injuries they've sustained. The races going out with fractured or broken ribs. That is a risk. And motorsports, I love motorsport, but watching some of the V8 Supercar reruns that I've been watching the last couple of days, some of the shunts they've had are ridiculous. And yet, a couple of weeks later, They're back in the cockpit, they're back in the car, they're racing again. Admittedly, they might have a swollen ankle or some broken ribs, and you're thinking, you know, they might have 2 or 3 races a weekend, they might have a couple more shunts. And there does come a point where even with all the safety features we have in motorsport now, they're told you cannot race for, a couple of weeks, not allowed to race. So there is that. Look, it's an interesting debate, concussion and injury, and yeah, it's not just head contact; it's all injuries. I think ice hockey is getting a lot better. The NHL is, as the leading league, is getting a lot better. Um, the mindset of can you still stand up? Can you skate? Yes, coach, get out there. But I can't see straight. But can you skate? Yeah. So I think that mindset's going out the window. I think there's very few old school coaches left. They generally have been retired out of the league. Um, American football, however, yeah, completely different kettle of fish. I don't think American football was really on the same wavelength, but ice hockey definitely is. I think ice hockey is definitely taking the right proactive steps over the last, I'm going to say 5 6 years. But American football, I'm not so sure about. I don't think they have taken the same proactive steps that ice hockey has. Ice hockey, I think, still has a long way to go in that regard, but it's definitely made some positive steps in the right direction. But hockey players are a different breed. They really are. The brutality they put themselves through week in, week out, day in, day out. They might have 3, 4 games in a week. They might have 2 back to backs and then a third game on the fourth day, and then a game 2 days later. That's a lot of games. But you will see players put on long term injured reserve, and actually they do tend to look after them a lot better than they used to. There's been some high profile incidents of players not being looked after in the right way. Um, we're seeing less of that now. The NFL already this season, Miami Dolphins fans will tell you the protocols may not have been followed correctly. But it's an interesting talking about player welfare because I do videos on it. Historically, people just don't want to watch. They're not interested. I think things are starting to change in recent years. Anyway, I'm going to call that a stream. I want to get an early night. I've got a lot of paperwork to do for work and other bits and pieces. I've got to do some bits and pieces. But thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate all the questions, and I will have some more content for you guys very, very soon.